when you talk about the Mount Rushmore of horror characters, I just don't think there's any denying that the top two are Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. Now, I've already done a video on the channel counting down my top 15 Dracula movies, so now it's time to do the same for Mary Shelley's creature. My name is Daniel with the Cobwebs channel, and you are watching my top 15 Frankenstein movies of all time.
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
Frankenstein!
Just one quick disclaimer before we get going, and that is that I'm talking very specifically about Frankenstein movies, not movies that are inspired by the Frankenstein story, of which there are many, like Reanimator, Frankenhooker, The Hunchback of the Morgue, even the recent Lisa Frankenstein. For this list, it's got to be explicitly a Frankenstein story. Sound simple enough? Let's get going.
Well, we warned you.
Kicking off at number 15 with Flesh for Frankenstein from 1973. Written and directed by Paul Morrissey, Flesh for Frankenstein stars Udo Kier as Baron Frankenstein, who is trying to bring to life not one, but two stitched together creatures so they can mate and breed him a master race that will bend only to his will. I actually watched this movie to make this list and was really excited because I love Blood for Dracula, which this same team made right after this. And you know what? I did not love Flesh for Frankenstein quite as much. Now, this movie is insanely over the top, ridiculous. I think it's going for a bit of a horror comedy kind of thing, but I didn't actually find it funny. But it is fascinating just to watch how far it will go to try to be sick and twisted. I do respect the very original take on the story, where it's all about creating a monster and a bride and having them bear children. There's not a lot of other Frankenstein stories that are like that, but that interesting idea never really leads anywhere at all, and it deprives us of having a Frankenstein's monster, which most of the time is what we're coming to these movies for. And I think that's why I prefer Blood for Dracula. It is satisfying in the ways you want a Dracula movie to be, and Flesh for Frankenstein isn't. But where I think this movie does shine is the gore. The gore is pretty spectacular. Just the atmosphere of Frankenstein and his assistant in a frankly gorgeous laboratory, taking body parts apart, stitching them together, and you see so much of the process, is actually pretty interesting and pretty cool from a practical effects standpoint. And this movie has one of the best decapitations I have ever seen. I was practically howling when that came on screen. It was awesome. At number 14, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1994. Directed by and starring Shakespeare veteran Kenneth Branagh as Victor Frankenstein, a young man who is obsessed with conquering death and bringing his own creation to life. But of course, he gets more than he bargained for. Despite the fact that I don't love this movie, which is why it's low enough on the list, I really think no Frankenstein list is complete without it, because it is by far the most faithful adaptation of the original Mary Shelley novel. Years ago, I first watched this movie right after reading the book, and that really jumped out to me and was pretty cool to watch the novel that I had just read play out on screen so faithfully, not entirely, but actually pretty close. And Kenneth Branagh directs this movie with so much energy and style, possibly to its detriment. It's extremely loud, hypersensory, operatic, and I do respect that Kenneth Branagh clearly believes this is one of the greatest stories of all time, and he is going to treat it as such, like this is Shakespeare. And that kind of attitude brought to this classic science fiction gothic horror story, I just really respect that, and I do respect how well made this movie is. Kenneth Branagh is actually a pretty great Victor Frankenstein. I really like him in this movie, but where the movie just really falls off for me is Robert De Niro as the monster. He is such a strange choice, and I just don't think it worked out. What Robert De Niro does best, which is often being naturalistic, low-key, and just being his Robert De Niro persona that's so iconic, it does not translate at all to Frankenstein's monster. Plus, I know Frankenstein's monster is supposed to be ugly, but I think this takes it too far. It's too off-putting. I don't want to look at it. A horror monster should be something that a horror fan would want an action figure of on their shelf. I don't want an action figure of this anywhere near my house. At number 13, The Bride from 1985. The Bride sets itself up as a sequel to the iconic Bride of Frankenstein, picking up with the castle being destroyed, but none of the characters actually dying. The monster goes on the run to start his own life as a circus performer, and Dr. Frankenstein names the bride Eva and tries to teach her to be the perfect woman. This is definitely an interesting one to put on the list because it's so different. This is not a horror movie at all. This very much is a costume drama that just happens to use the characters of Frankenstein as its characters. The cast is kind of interesting. You've got Sting as Dr. Frankenstein, who's the weak link of the movie. I think he's just not up to the acting powers of everyone else around him. And he really plays Dr. Frankenstein as an arrogant, spoiled, horrible person that you want absolutely nothing to do with. I do really like Jennifer Beals as the bride. Very, very beautiful and has a very interesting story as a woman who has no idea what her macabre origins are. But Clancy Brown as the monster is probably my favorite thing about this movie, as well as his relationship with a circus performer played by David Rappaport. And they have this beautiful friendship that I was like really emotionally invested in. And speaking of emotions, I do think this movie has a pretty beautiful emotional ending as well. It's an interesting little drama that happens to be a Frankenstein movie, and it's pretty good at it. At number 12, The Monster Squad from 1987. 12-year-old Sean Crenshaw and his best friends are die-hard monster fanatics and form a group called the Monster Squad. But when Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, and other monsters come to their small town to get an amulet to control the world, Sean leads his friends into action to protect their town from the forces of evil. But the Frankenstein monster might just switch sides to come to their aid. I'll be honest with you right now, I feel a little bit bad putting this movie on the list, because is this a Frankenstein movie? It's a fun little monster mashup movie, kids movie made in the 80s. Not a movie that I grew up with, so not a movie that I truly love with my heart, but I do really enjoy it. I think it's a lot of fun. I think most of the versions of the monsters are pretty darn good, but my favorite monster in this movie is Tom Noonan as the Frankenstein monster. A slightly different design than the classic Universal version, as all of them are, because they didn't quite have the rights to those Universal classics, but I do really like this design, and he really captures how sympathetic Boris Karloff was. And you like his bond and friendship that he forms with the little girl in this movie. It's a bit of a redemption of what happened with Frankenstein and the little girl in the original Frankenstein. So that's definitely heartwarming. Is it a Frankenstein movie? You know, debatable, but it's got a really good version of the Frankenstein monster. At number 11, Young Frankenstein from 1974. From comedy legend Mel Brooks, Young Frankenstein is a spoof of the classic Universal Frankenstein films that follows Gene Wilder as the great-grandson of the legendary Dr. Frankenstein, himself named Dr. Frederick Frankenstein.
That's Frankenstein.
Okay, sorry, I meant Dr. Frederick Frankenstein. He inherits the family estate in Transylvania and travels there only to fall into the family business of reviving a monster. I think some people might be mad that I had this movie as low as it is because it's definitely a classic, and I know a lot of people consider it like basically a comedy masterpiece. Now, comedy is subjective, and for me, I think a lot of the jokes in this movie don't really land. So it's a comedy with tons of jokes, tons of opportunities to make you crack up laughing, and a lot of them fall flat for me, especially in the first half before the Frankenstein monster is revived. But I do really like Gene Wilder as Dr. Frederick Frankenstein. His mad performance, the way he's just screaming and yelling through this whole movie, is super entertaining. And I do come to like this movie a lot more when Peter Boyle as the monster is revived, because I love him as the monster. He just seems like this sweet, goofy guy who's just kind of always confused, and you really just feel your heart go out to him, and he's just so much fun to watch. So as long as he's on screen, I definitely find this movie more charming, more funny, and the look of this movie is incredible, and it's definitely a successful homage to the original Universal Frankenstein movies, especially the third one, Son of Frankenstein. It follows that one's plot the most closely. At number 10, Abbot and Castello Meet Frankenstein from 1948. The world of freight handlers Wilbur and Chick is turned upside down when the remains of Frankenstein's monster and Dracula arrive from Europe to be used in a house of horrors. Dracula awakens and escapes with the weakened monster, who he plans to re-energize with a new brain. The Wolfman arrives from London in an attempt to stop Dracula, while the vampire abducts Wilbur to use his brain for the monster. But when the full moon rises, all hell breaks loose, with the Wolfman, Dracula, and Frankenstein all running rampant. I'll be honest, this one is a little bit of a tie between this, House of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. I didn't want to totally flood this list with the Universal series. There's still a good bit on there, and I decided to pick one, and this one is definitely my favorite, although it's stacked status as a Frankenstein movie. A little bit like the Monster Squad, it's a little questionable because there's no Dr. Frankenstein in this movie. However, Dracula really acts as the Dr. Frankenstein character. Bela Lugosi reprising his role from the 1931 Dracula. That's just so cool to see. And I wanted to get some representation for Glenn Strange as the Frankenstein monster. He's actually my second favorite actor to play the monster in the old Universal series, so great to have him here on the list. This movie, I think it's perfect. It's my favorite horror comedy of all time. I like Abbot and Castello. I think they made a lot of solid movies, but I think they were never better, never funnier than in this movie. And I just love how the world of the Universal monsters is taken seriously, and we're just dropping in a couple of goofy guys to add some laughs. That's a great formula. It works perfectly. Quality-wise, I would have it much higher, but because it's not a pure Frankenstein movie, had to bump it down a little bit. I just love how this movie uses the typical switching brains plot of a Frankenstein movie for comedic effect with Lou Costello. At number 9, we've got Lady Frankenstein from 1971. An Italian Gothic retelling of the story where Dr. Frankenstein is immediately killed after reviving the monster he created, and then we follow his daughter and his lab assistant who continue his experiments. The Baroness Frankenstein decides the lab assistant's brain in the body of a simple but attractive servant would make the perfect lover for her and the perfect warrior to kill the violent monster who is now on a murderous rampage. Now, I admit this Italian horror film doesn't start out so strong because it just feels like a weaker version of a Hammer Frankenstein movie, but when Joseph Cotten as Dr. Frankenstein is killed, the movie just takes off and becomes something so much more interesting, unique, and really sick and demented. I do love Rosalba Neri as the Baroness Frankenstein, a very cold, chilling, evil mad scientist character who does horrible, sick, and twisted things in this movie that just make this film very entertaining, frankly. Now, the Frankenstein monster himself looks pretty bad. He's got like this ridiculous looking eye bulging out. Not very good makeup, but he's not the reason we're here. We're here to watch the demented scientist, Baroness Frankenstein, do horrible things, conduct sick experiments, and try to make the perfect lover for herself by merging the body she wants with the brain she wants. If you like Italian Gothic films, I think this is one of the more entertaining ones I've seen. At number 8, we've got Victor Frankenstein from 2015. This version of the story is told from the perspective of Igor, Frankenstein's assistant, and we see his origins as a circus performer, his redemptive friendship with the young medical student Victor von Frankenstein, and his experience in assisting with the creation of a legendary monster. So this is probably my pick for the most underrated movie on this list. When this movie came out, it actually broke a record for the lowest opening weekend for a wide release film, and the record wouldn't be broken for a few years later. It did not get good reviews, and it's still not well respected to this day. But I think this movie is kind of great. It's starring Daniel Radcliffe as Igor, a very sympathetic and likable lead character to go through this story with. And then you've got James McAvoy as Dr. Frankenstein. Fantastic in this movie. I love his incredibly energetic and manic performance as this mad scientist, but one who's incredibly charismatic, and you cannot help but get drawn in by him. Watching them go through this scientific adventure together actually makes this feel a lot like the Hammer Frankenstein movies, where you've got Dr. Frankenstein and a very human assistant just trying to figure this thing out, because this movie is all about the process. And maybe that would be a big disappointment for people because we don't get an actual Frankenstein monster until the end of the film. But I just find the process of building this monster so interesting in this movie and very high energy. And the movie does pepper enough horror sequences throughout to keep you satisfied, like with a monstrous baboon that they revive as a test run. This came out at a time when classic monster reboots were pretty much all action blockbusters, which makes this movie all the more refreshing because it really retains the spirit of what a Frankenstein movie should be. At number 7, we've got Son of Frankenstein from 1939. Basil Rathbone stars as the son of the late Dr. Frankenstein, who inherits his family's estate and moves in with his wife and son. There he discovers his father's monstrous creation is still alive and in a coma, and he is drawn into the temptation of scientific discovery. He revives the monster and discovers it is controlled by the evil Igor, who is bent on revenge. This is the third film in the classic Universal Frankenstein series, and this often does not get as much respect as the first two in the series, partially for understandable reasons. I mean, Boris Karloff's character of the monster does take a bit of a backseat. He's no longer able to talk. He's a less emotive, active redemptive character in the story, but that is more than made up for by the fact that Basil Rathbone is so good as our lead Dr. Frankenstein character, a fantastic replacement for Colin Clive. And I think the idea to follow Frankenstein's son in the third film was just a fantastic idea, and it worked out really well in this movie. But the star of the show is Bela Lugosi as Igor, who gives a phenomenal performance as this very off-putting, grotesque, kind of monstrous guy. The character of Igor is now synonymous with the Frankenstein story, and I think a lot of people don't realize that the hunchback assistant in the original Frankenstein is not Igor. This film has the birth of the Igor character, and I'd say it's still the best version to date. At number 6, we've got Frankenstein, the True Story from 1973. This is a made-for-television adaptation of the story that takes a lot of interesting liberties. Victor Frankenstein is a medical student who meets a fellow student who's actually much further along than he is on researching life and death. This other student actually draws in Frankenstein on his experiments with creating a man. And when Frankenstein finishes what he started, he does create a perfect, beautiful, and intelligent man who he tries to teach to be the perfect human being until the monster starts deteriorating into something more horrific, and Frankenstein rejects him, much to the monster's murderous rage. I checked this movie out not long ago with low expectations because it is made for television and it's 3 hours long, so I knew if it was going to be bad, it was going to be kind of excruciating. But actually, it was phenomenal. This is a great, great version of the Frankenstein story. Never feels long at 3 hours because what it has to tell is so fascinating, and I love all the differentiations that this takes with the story. When the monster, played by Michael Sarrazin, was revived, I found myself a little bit disappointed because I wanted a monster, not this handsome dude. But then I found myself so satisfied as I realized that the process that they had done to regenerate the dead flesh that they had cut off of dead bodies was reversing, was deteriorating, and I love going through this movie watching the monster become more and more horrific, and while always being an interesting and sympathetic character, watching him become more angry and bitter as Frankenstein rejects him and he finds the world around him to be incredibly difficult to live in. Once you're about halfway through this movie, you know anytime the monster shows up, he is going to wreck shop. He is truly a monster in this, doing horrible things, but again, always being interesting and sympathetic. This has a great cast of mostly actors I wasn't familiar with, but are all fantastic. But I do have to shout out James Mason as a very creepy older scientist, and Jane Seymour as a Bride of Frankenstein, whose story takes very interesting turns. One character of the classic Frankenstein story that shows up again and again is Elizabeth, Victor Frankenstein's girlfriend / wife, depending on what version you watch. And I have to say, this is the best version of Elizabeth that I have seen. An absolutely ruthless character who will do anything to make sure that her husband, Victor Frankenstein, is free of all consequences of his actions, no matter the cost. At number 5, The Revenge of Frankenstein from 1958. The second film in the Hammer Frankenstein series, Baron Frankenstein narrowly avoids his death sentence for his scientific crimes and relocates under a new name so he can continue his experiments. There he builds a new and improved creature using a willing brain donor, his handicapped assistant who longs for a better life. But can Frankenstein's experiments ever truly be successful? Or will this creature deteriorate into a murderous madman? This is a fantastic example of a Frankenstein sequel, where the original film tells a more traditional Frankenstein story. This one has him advancing in his experiments. He always wanted to create a beautiful and intelligent creature, and here he actually does it. Michael Gwynn is fantastic as our creature, really just gets every bit of sympathy we could possibly feel for a Frankenstein monster. And you might think this is disappointing because here we've got a handsome, intelligent creature instead of a spooky monster that we all really want to see. But much like with Frankenstein, the True Story, his deterioration as the experiment starts going wrong is also pretty interesting. And Peter Cushing is just the greatest Dr. Frankenstein. And I also love his relationship with his assistant, Hans, who make a really good team in this movie. At number 4, we've got Frankenstein Created Woman from 1967. The fourth film in Hammer's series, a scarred and tormented girl named Christina drowns herself after her lover, Hans, is framed for murder and guillotined. Baron Frankenstein, experimenting with the transfer of souls, places the boy's soul into her body, bringing Christina and Hans back to life. Driven by revenge, they carry out a violent retribution on those responsible for their deaths by using Christina's newfound beauty. Of all the films on this list, of all the interesting and unique takes on the story, this is the weirdest and the most unique, and I love it. I am a huge fan of Hammer films, but not all of them have a really compelling story, and this one very much does. I love the characters. I love Hans and Christina. You really feel for their relationship and just hate the tragedy that befalls them. So it ends up being a really good and really satisfying revenge movie. And as a Frankenstein movie, Peter Cushing is amazing, always the smartest, wittiest guy in any room. And again, I love how this movie also continues his experiments moving forward. This time we're dealing with the metaphysical, the philosophical, the soul, and putting the two lovers together into one body so that they can carry out revenge together. Super weird. I think it's awesome. I love this movie. At number 3, we've got The Bride of Frankenstein from 1935. The second film in Universal's Frankenstein series, Bride of Frankenstein begins where James Whale's Frankenstein from 1931 left off, with Dr. Frankenstein having not been killed and now wanting to get away from his mad experiments. Yet when his wife is kidnapped by his creation, Frankenstein, as well as the mysterious Dr. Pretorius, agree to help him create a new monster as a companion, this time a woman. Now, I absolutely love this movie for a lot of reasons. I do love the interesting social commentary you can read into it. I do love the look of it, the incredibly iconic scenery, and even the giant chair that the Frankenstein gets strapped into is such just phenomenal Frankenstein imagery. It just doesn't get much better than that. But what really makes this movie is Boris Karloff giving one of the best performances in the entire horror genre. I keep hitting this point about how I like sequels to move things forward and not just spinning their wheels doing the same thing again, and this movie really moves his character forward, with him becoming a little bit more like the monster of the book that he wasn't in the first movie, learning to talk, becoming more of a thinking, active character in the movie, really the main character of the film. And this might be the only Frankenstein movie where the Frankenstein monster is unequivocally the lead. This is also the first piece of media that gives us the Bride of Frankenstein. In the original book, Dr. Frankenstein almost creates a female companion for the monster, but doesn't go through with it, chickens out, and ends up destroying his work, much to the anger of the monster. But here, he ends up going through with it. And Elsa Lanchester and the design of the bride is just beyond iconic, phenomenal. However, as you can tell about this movie's placement, this isn't my favorite Universal Frankenstein movie. And that's because its sense of humor is at times a little bit goofier than I want it to be. And I do think I prefer the science fiction horror of the first film, rather than the more fantasy horror of this movie that kind of takes me out of the reality of the Universal Frankenstein universe. At number 2, we've got The Curse of Frankenstein from 1957. The first Hammer Frankenstein film and the studio's first color gothic, Peter Cushing stars as Baron Victor von Frankenstein, who has discovered the secrets of life and death. He brings to life a horrifying creature with a mad tendency to kill. Now, trying to rank my top 2, it's like trying to pick my children. They're basically tied. And sometimes I do think this is my favorite Frankenstein movie. It just feels so personal to me. It's just one of my personal favorite movies of all time, favorite horror films. I do think it is my favorite Hammer horror film. Peter Cushing as Dr. Frankenstein is one of my favorite characters of all time. I just love how cold, calculating, witty, and brilliant he is. A character whose only moral compass is just scientific discovery, and anything he has to do in service of that is worth it. So I find him fascinating. Here we get Christopher Lee as the Frankenstein monster, who could not be more different from the Boris Karloff version. When Hammer made this film, they did not have the rights to anything Universal did, so they had to be very different, and this film is extremely different. While Boris Karloff is definitely much more of a character with an incredible and iconic design, Christopher Lee very much feels like a sad, pathetic, reanimated corpse. And you feel a little bit sympathetic for him because he just feels like a thing that should not exist in this world, but he also just makes you feel uncomfortable uncomfortable. His design is absolutely hideous. If I was confronted with Christopher Lee Frankenstein and Boris Karloff Frankenstein, I'd be much more scared of Christopher Lee. He has a horrifying and very off-putting look, but in a way that I do find still pretty cool. I do really like the design. This is a beautiful, lush, color gothic film that actually had much more blood and gore than pretty much any other movie around this time period, which makes it very interesting as a historical document, I think. But at number 1, we've got Frankenstein from 1931. The film that kicked off the iconic Universal Frankenstein series, Colin Clive stars as Dr. Henry Frankenstein, who stitches together stolen body parts to create a monster played by Boris Karloff. This was not the first adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That was actually a 1910 silent short, but this is really the movie that kicks off the idea of a Frankenstein film in pop culture. And really, it's never been replaced. For as many Frankenstein movies as there have been since this, and we've talked about a lot of them, this is still the most important and the most iconic. I love this movie ever since I was a kid. I've been living and breathing James Whale's Frankenstein for as long as I can remember. Boris Karloff is just amazing in this. The design is my favorite design of any monster ever. I think it's the most iconic monster makeup of all time. The original novel also almost totally skips over the process of reviving the monster, so this is the film that sets the standard of the lightning, rising the monster up and having him be struck by lightning, electricity bringing him to life. That's all from this movie. It's really not like the book at all, so this movie is really as responsible for Frankenstein being iconic as the original book is. An incredibly important movie, but one that I love watching over and over again. A satisfying horror film experience in just over an hour. Frankenstein is perfect. That's my list, folks, and if you enjoyed it, check out my list of my top 15 Dracula movies. I'll link that right over here. I've also got the playlist of all of my horror movie rankings. Got a ton of top 10, top 15, top 20 lists on a lot of spooky horror topics. And if you want to see more videos like this, definitely give a subscribe to the channel because I've got a lot more coming on the way, and give the video a like as well. Thank you so much for watching. With all that said, don't forget to enjoy yourself today, have some fun, don't get struck by lightning, and I'll see you next time.